The evolution of the story for Godzilla began with producer Tomoyuki Tanaka selecting the popular thriller novelist of that era, Shigeru Kayama, to write the original story. Tanaka looked at Kayama as an ideal choice because he had written several stories that featured mutant sea creatures. Special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya paid Kayama a high compliment in discussing the film many years later, writing, "Our film was a big experiment, so to cover up all of its shortcomings, we needed to have a better story. That was the idea, so Kayama carried a big responsibility." In less than 3 weeks, Kayama penned the basic scenario, weaving a story of nuclear protest into a giant monster tale. Translating this story into a full screenplay was a task assumed by Takeo Murata and director Ishiro Honda. Murata was one of Toho's senior assistant directors, had served as both director and screenwriter, and was well liked by all levels of staff, and he was also a good friend of producer Iwao Mori. To flesh out the story, the pair locked themselves up in a Japanese inn for 3 weeks, collaborating to produce a draft screenplay which would eventually undergo 2 more revisions. Although Honda himself co-wrote the script, he retained a flexible approach to filming the final draft. A number of scenes were either struck from the approved script prior to filming or were filmed but later discarded in post-production. Unfortunately, when scenes were deleted, the negatives were destroyed and scenes were lost forever, save for a few still photographs. At one point, there was a plan to film a flashback scene of Emiko and Serizawa, showing the two of them as teenagers to establish the long-standing platonic nature of their relationship. One source has even implied that these photos were taken during the casting process when Hirata was being considered for the role of Ogata. Whatever their true nature, they offer an interesting look into an unexplored story angle. The entire Odo Island sequence was rearranged once the research team reached the island. Originally, the research team established a camp on the beach and investigated the devastated village a full day prior to Godzilla's appearance. One of their first actions was to visit a cemetery as Shinkichi mourned his mother and brother, and this was a scene which was filmed but later cut. The first day sweep of the island by the science team uncovers the presence of radiation everywhere in the village. The discovery of the trilobite is not made at this time, and instead, an unfilmed scene inside Dr. Yamane and Emiko's tent was to have taken place the night after the initial exploration. Here, the scientist hints to Emiko that he knows what is responsible for the village's destruction, though it's really quite too fantastic for him to actually say it yet. Emiko and Ogata stroll the beach before the rest of the team has awoken. As Emiko breathes in the fresh morning air, she is startled to see a huge rock in the surf suddenly begin to vibrate. And when she screams, Ogata notices that this boulder is actually moving, and it's intended that this is the tip of Godzilla's tail. Shinkichi rushes forth from his tent with a rifle, and he fires off a few shots as this rock disappears behind a cliff. The live-action portion of this sequence was actually filmed, but eventually was discarded weeks later. From this point forward, the ringing of the bell and the appearance of Godzilla over the mountain occurs, although the first glimpse of Godzilla was meant to be a bit more shocking. A bleeding cow was to be hanging from Godzilla's mouth, a carryover from the original story that emphasized Godzilla's hunger as a reason for him to appear. Test shots of this effect were actually taken, but cameraman Arakawa convinced Eiji Tsuburaya that the scene was just a bit too gruesome, so a close-up of Godzilla's head was done to show him merely roaring, and that's what was used in the film. Godzilla then sets the mountaintop afire before disappearing. Dropping this idea was a wise alteration that allowed the atomic breath to be revealed later as a surprise tactic against the electrical towers. After Godzilla slips back into the ocean, Dr. Yamane's group was to walk amidst gigantic footprints on the beach where the trilobite is finally found. This scene was never filmed, although the image of the footprints on the beach was retained, shown in the film as a long shot from the top of the hill with a well-executed matte painting. Some subtle touches of characterization were also removed from the screenplay which, although interesting, were not really vital to the story. One such scene shows all the principal characters riding in a car through Tokyo upon their return from Odo Island. The implication of Ogata sitting in the front seat while Serizawa sat in the back with Emiko and Dr. Yamane is obvious. Dr. Yamane is shown to consider Serizawa as a future son-in-law as well as a scientific colleague. Another small unfilmed scene shows two men discussing their fears on a rainy street corner as a radio reports news of Godzilla. Everyone kind of seems struck by a sense of dread or fear, except for a dark, wounded war veteran standing in the background, and that's Dr. Serizawa. Also unfilmed was a scene that explains why Dr. Yamane arrives home very depressed in the middle portion of the film, asking to be left alone in his study. The scene is set in a beer hall, and the patrons are all cheering a TV report on the depth charge operation, assuming Godzilla has been destroyed. Amidst all the revelry, the somber figure of Dr. Yamane, who has been sitting alone to the side, gets up and leaves. Although the film concludes with a somber salute to the sacrifice of Dr. Serizawa, the story, as originally written, was intended to finish with Ogata and Emiko flying out over Tokyo Bay in a helicopter, dropping a memorial wreath for Serizawa into the waters below. While a nice personal tribute from his friends, this scene was unnecessary after the salute aboard the ship, and it was dropped by director Honda, allowing the film to conclude on a less sentimental note.